Margaret Walsh was sorting through her grandmother's attic in Denver when she discovered a wooden trunk filled with old photographs and documents. Most were typical family portraits and land deeds, but one image stopped her cold. The formal class, portrait dated November 1891, showed Miss Elizabeth Morrison standing proudly behind 12 children arranged in 2 neat rows at a remote one-room schoolhouse. Miss Morrison appeared to be the ideal frontier educator, young, well-dressed, with a maternal smile as she posed with her students. The children, ranging from 6 to 14 years old, were immaculately groomed and dressed in their finest clothes, clearly prepared for this special photograph. But something deeply unsettling about the children's expressions made Margaret examine the image more closely. While Miss Morrison beamed with pride, the students' faces showed a mixture of fear and resignation that seemed inappropriate for a school portrait. Their eyes appeared hollow, and several children had dark circles under their eyes, suggesting poor health or lack of sleep. The schoolhouse itself was unusually well appointed for such a remote location. Through the windows, the harsh landscape of the Colorado Territory stretched toward distant mountains, emphasizing the isolation of the settlement. Everything appeared perfect, too perfect. Margaret turned the photograph over and found an inscription that made her blood run cold. Final class at Morrison's Academy, Silverbrook, Colorado, November 15th, 1891. May God forgive us for what we didn't see. Below that, in different handwriting, someone had added, "The children tried to tell us." The photograph's exceptional quality suggested an expensive photographer had traveled specifically to document this classroom. But the word "final" and the ominous inscriptions suggested this wasn't a celebration. It was documentation of something terrible. Margaret had inherited more than just a photograph. She had inherited a mystery that would reveal one of the most horrific crimes in frontier history, hidden in plain sight for over 130 years. Margaret brought the photograph to a local antique dealer who specialized in frontier memorabilia. Under professional magnification equipment, the disturbing details became impossible to ignore. The children weren't just nervous about being photographed. They were displaying signs of systematic abuse and terror. Young Timothy Brooks, a boy of about 8 in the front row, had visible bruising around his wrists that had been partially concealed by his shirt sleeves. 10-year-old Mary Sullivan's dress couldn't hide the unnatural thinness of her arms, suggesting prolonged malnourishment. 14-year-old James Carter, the oldest student, had what appeared to be recent cuts on his hands and face. As Margaret continued examining each child, she realized that every single student showed physical signs of abuse. The younger children displayed the hollow-eyed look of chronic fear, while the older students had injuries that suggested they had tried to resist or protect the younger ones. Most chilling was what the children were holding. Hidden in their hands, positioned carefully to be visible only under close examination, were small objects, pieces of paper, twisted cloth, even what appeared to be carved wooden tokens. These weren't school supplies or toys. They looked like desperate messages or pleas for help. Margaret could make out partial writing on some of the paper scraps. One child clutched what appeared to be a note with "help" barely visible. Another held a small piece of wood with what looked like scratched letters spelling "she kills." Miss Morrison's own positioning now seemed sinister rather than maternal. Her hands rested on the shoulders of 2 younger children in a way that appeared controlling rather than protective. Her smile, which had initially seemed warm, now looked predatory when viewed alongside the children's obvious terror. The classroom itself revealed additional disturbing details under magnification. What Margaret had taken for educational materials were actually restraints, rope coiled under desks, and what appeared to be locks on the windows. This wasn't a school. It was a prison where children were being systematically tortured and murdered by their trusted teacher. Margaret researched Silverbrook, Colorado, and discovered that the settlement had vanished from historical records immediately after November 1891. Unlike other abandoned frontier towns, there were no gradual population declines or economic explanations. The community had simply disappeared overnight. She contacted the Colorado State Historical Society and spoke with curator James Thornton, who had spent decades studying abandoned frontier settlements. When Margaret described the photograph and its inscriptions, his voice became grave. "Silverbrook is one of our unsolved mysteries," Thornton explained. In late 1891, the territorial marshal received reports of missing children from surrounding communities. Parents claimed their children had been sent to a highly regarded school in Silverbrook, but had never returned home for visits as promised. Margaret arranged to meet Thornton at the Historical Society, where he showed her the sparse records that remained about Silverbrook. The settlement had been established in 1889 around Morrison's Academy, which had advertised itself as a premier educational institution for frontier families who wanted their children to receive proper schooling. Newspaper advertisements from 1890 showed that Morrison's Academy had recruited students from across the Colorado Territory, promising superior education in a wholesome environment away from the corruptions of mining towns and cattle camps. Parents had paid substantial fees to send their children to board at the school, but by fall 1891, concerns were mounting. A letter to the territorial governor from a father in Denver, dated October 1891, expressed growing worry. "My daughter, Catherine, was sent to Morrison's Academy in January, with promises of monthly letters and holiday visits. We have received only 2 brief notes since then, both claiming she is too busy with studies to write more. When I traveled to Silverbrook last month, I was told she was on a field trip and could not be seen." Thornton showed Margaret additional letters from concerned parents, all describing similar patterns: children who stopped communicating, visiting restrictions, and evasive responses from Miss Morrison when parents inquired about their children's welfare. The final official document about Silverbrook was a territorial marshal's report dated December 1, 1891. Arrived at reported location of Morrison's Academy to investigate missing children complaints. Found abandoned buildings with evidence of recent habitation, but no residents present. Investigation ongoing. Margaret found the complete territorial marshal's files at the Denver Public Library's Western History Collection. U.S. Marshal William Crawford had conducted a thorough investigation of the abandoned Silverbrook settlement in December 1891, and his findings were deeply disturbing. Crawford's initial report described finding the schoolhouse and surrounding buildings completely deserted, but with signs that people had left hastily. Tables set for meals, books open on desks, personal belongings scattered throughout the buildings. Whatever caused the residents to flee happened suddenly. But Crawford's more detailed examination revealed horrifying evidence of systematic abuse and murder. In the schoolhouse basement, he had discovered what he described as a chamber of horrors: restraints, torture implements, and what appeared to be a makeshift morgue. Crawford's report continued. Found evidence suggesting multiple children had been imprisoned in the basement. Restraints sized for small bodies, scratched messages on walls, and what appears to be dried blood throughout the lower level. The scene suggests prolonged captivity and systematic torture. Most damning was Crawford's discovery of Miss Morrison's personal quarters. In the teacher's room, found detailed journals documenting the systematic abuse and murder of at least 20 children over a period of 2 years. The entries describe experiments in causing pain and terror, with clinical detachment that suggests severe mental derangement. Crawford had also found Morrison's recruitment records, which showed she had specifically targeted children from distant communities or families with limited means to check on their welfare. Subject appears to have deliberately selected victims whose disappearances would not be immediately investigated, Crawford noted. The marshal's investigation revealed that Elizabeth Morrison had used her position as an educator to lure children to an isolated location where she could torture and kill them without interference. The remote location and her respectable profession had provided perfect cover for her crimes. Crawford's final report, marked confidential, described finding a mass grave containing the remains of numerous children. Based on clothing fragments and personal effects, estimate at least 18 victims buried on the property. Coroner's examination suggests deaths occurred over extended period, consistent with journal entries describing prolonged torture sessions. Margaret's most disturbing discovery came when she found excerpts from Elizabeth Morrison's journals, preserved in the territorial marshal's evidence files. The entries revealed a woman who derived sadistic pleasure from the suffering of children. using her position as teacher to satisfy her murderous impulses. Morrison's early entries from 1889 showed her calculating approach to establishing her killing ground. The frontier provides perfect opportunities. Parents desperate for education will send children great distances and ask few questions. Once isolated, the children become completely dependent on my mercy I choose not to provide. Her methods were carefully planned to maximize both her victim's suffering and her own protection from discovery. The children arrive eager to learn, trusting completely in my authority as their teacher. This trust makes them perfect victims. They obey orders even when those orders lead to their destruction. Morrison's journals revealed she had developed elaborate torture methods disguised as educational activities. Discipline sessions involved prolonged physical abuse justified as moral instruction. Special lessons were private torture sessions, conducted in the basement. Field trips were opportunities to dispose of bodies in remote locations. Most chilling were Morrison's descriptions of her victims' reactions. Little Sarah begged for her parents until the very end. Her pleas provided exquisite entertainment during her final days. The youngest ones cry the most beautifully. Their terror is pure and uncontaminated by adult understanding of their fate. Morrison had also documented her pleasure in deceiving. Parents wrote cheerful letters to Timothy's father, describing his excellent progress while the boy's body decomposed in the well. The father's grateful response, praising my dedication to his son's education, provided almost as much satisfaction as the murder itself. Her final entries from November 1891 showed growing recklessness and grandiosity. My collection grows, more perfect with each edition. The children's fear seasons their deaths like fine wine. I have achieved what other teachers only dream of: absolute control over young minds, exercised to their final breath. The journals revealed that Morrison viewed education and murder as intertwined activities, believing she was teaching her victims the ultimate lesson about powerlessness and death. Margaret discovered a collection of letters between parents and territorial authorities, revealing the agonizing process of families realizing their children had been murdered by someone they trusted completely. These letters, preserved in various archives, showed the devastating impact of Morrison's crimes on frontier families. Maria Rodriguez, whose 9-year-old son Diego had been sent to Morrison's academy in early 1891, wrote to the territorial governor, "In December, we saved for 2 years to send Diego to the finest school in Colorado. We believed we were giving him opportunities we never had. Instead, we delivered our precious boy to his killer. How do we live with this knowledge?" Thomas Sullivan, father of 10-year-old Mary, had written to his brother, "The marshal showed us Mary's dress, found in that woman's collection of trophies. Our little girl, who loved learning more than anything in the world, was murdered by the teacher she trusted and admired. The monster wore the face of everything we believed was good and safe." The letters revealed that many parents had initially refused to believe their children were dead, clinging to hope that Morrison had merely fled with the survivors. Father William Mackenzie wrote to federal authorities, "Surely some children escaped. Surely this demon did not murder all 23 children who attended her school. Please continue searching for survivors." But Marshal Crawford's investigation had found no survivors. Morrison's meticulous records indicated she had murdered every child who attended her academy over its 2-year operation. The photograph Margaret had discovered showed Morrison's final victims, children who would be dead within days of posing for the camera. The psychological impact on the surviving families was devastating. Several parents required medical treatment for severe depression. Catherine Murphy's mother never recovered from the guilt of sending her daughter to Morrison's academy, writing in her final letter, "I placed my child in the hands of evil while believing I was providing her with a bright future. This knowledge has destroyed my will to live." The parents formed a support group, meeting regularly to share their grief and demand justice. However, Elizabeth Morrison had vanished completely. After abandoning Silverbrook, leaving no trail for authorities to follow, the family's demands for her capture and execution went unfulfilled, adding to their anguish. Margaret's research revealed that Elizabeth Morrison had disappeared so completely after abandoning Silverbrook that authorities suspected she had either died or assumed a new identity. Marshal Crawford's investigation had uncovered disturbing evidence about Morrison's background that explained her ability to vanish without a trace. Morrison's teaching credentials were completely fabricated. The normal school in Kansas that supposedly issued her certificate had no record of her attendance. Her references were forged, and her previous employment history was entirely fictional. She had constructed her identity as a frontier educator, specifically to gain access to vulnerable children. Crawford's investigation revealed that Elizabeth Morrison was itself likely a false identity. Bank records showed she had accessed funds from accounts in multiple names across several territories, suggesting she had been operating under various identities for years before establishing her deadly academy. Most disturbing was evidence that Morrison's crimes might have extended beyond Silverbrook. Crawford found correspondence suggesting she had operated similar schools in other remote locations before establishing her Colorado academy. Found letters referencing previous teaching positions in Wyoming and Montana territories. Local authorities report missing children from the same time periods, Crawford noted. Federal marshals had launched a coordinated search across the Western territories, but Morrison seemed to have anticipated the need to disappear. Her personal quarters contained maps of remote areas throughout the West, detailed plans for assuming new identities, and substantial cash reserves hidden in various locations. A Pinkerton detective hired by several parents reported finding traces of Morrison's trail heading toward California, but the leads had gone cold by early 1892. Subject demonstrates sophisticated knowledge of evading law enforcement. Likely has assumed new identity and may have established another fraudulent educational institution, the detective concluded. The investigation was hampered by the limited communication systems of the 1890s frontier. By the time authorities in different territories could coordinate their efforts, Morrison had already vanished into the vast anonymity of the American West. Margaret realized that Morrison had chosen her victims and locations specifically to maximize her chances of escape. The isolated setting, trusting parents, and limited law enforcement infrastructure had provided perfect conditions for both her crimes and her disappearance. Margaret's examination of Morrison's final journal entries and the evidence from the schoolhouse revealed the horrific fate of the 12 children in the photograph. These final victims had endured weeks of escalating abuse as Morrison prepared to abandon her academy and eliminate all witnesses. Morrison's journal entries from November 1891 showed her growing excitement about her graduation ceremony, her euphemism for the mass murder of her remaining students. The final lesson begins tomorrow. My students will learn the ultimate truth about authority and submission. Their education will conclude with perfect understanding of their powerlessness. Physical evidence found in the schoolhouse basement revealed that Morrison had tortured the children individually over several days before the final killings. Marshal Crawford's report described finding restraints stained with blood, crude medical instruments, and detailed notes about each child's responses to different torture methods. Morrison had documented her victims' final days with clinical precision. Timothy lasted 3 days before breaking completely. His pleas for mercy provided excellent opportunities to explain the futility of hope. Mary showed more resilience, requiring additional persuasion to achieve proper submission. The photograph itself had been taken as Morrison's trophy, a final record of her complete control over her victims before their execution. Her journal entry about the photo session revealed her sadistic pleasure. Arranged for professional photographer to document my final class. The children's terror enhances their beauty. They understand they are posing for their memorial portraits. Crawford's investigation revealed that Morrison had drugged the children before the final killings, explaining their passive expressions in the photograph. Toxicology examination of remains suggests victims were administered laudanum or similar narcotic before death. This would explain their subdued appearance in the final photograph, his report noted. The murder weapons, knives and a small pistol, were found cleaned and arranged in Morrison's room like surgical instruments. Her methodical approach to killing suggested she viewed murder as a craft requiring proper tools and technique. Morrison's final journal entry, dated November 16, 1891, revealed her complete lack of remorse. 23 perfect lessons completed. Each child learned the ultimate truth about trust and authority. Their education is now complete, and mine continues elsewhere. Margaret discovered that territorial and federal authorities had deliberately suppressed details about Morrison's crimes, fearing that news of a school-based mass murder would damage efforts to establish Colorado statehood and attract settlers. To the frontier, Governor John Root had issued confidential orders to limit media coverage of the Silverbrook murders. A telegram from the governor's office to newspaper editors instructed them to report the incident as a tragic accident at a frontier school, without mentioning the systematic nature of Morrison's crimes or the evidence of prolonged torture. The official territorial report filed with Washington described the Silverbrook incident as unfortunate violence during a dispute between parents and a disturbed educator. There was no mention of Morrison's systematic murder of 23 children or the evidence of her calculated sadism. Federal authorities had been horrified by what Crawford's investigation revealed, but they agreed to suppress the details. A confidential report to the Department of Education recommended avoiding publicity that might discourage families from seeking frontier education opportunities. The report suggested that full disclosure might damage public confidence in territorial schooling systems. The parents of Morrison's victims were pressured to remain silent about the true nature of their children's deaths. Territorial officials offered modest financial compensation in exchange for signed agreements not to discuss details of the case with media or other families. Several parents refused these arrangements and attempted to publicize Morrison's crimes independently. However, their efforts were undermined by official denials and suggestions that grief had caused them to exaggerate the circumstances of their children's deaths. The schoolhouse and other buildings at Silverbrook were burned by territorial authorities. In spring 1892, officially to prevent disease, but actually to eliminate physical evidence of Morrison's crimes. The mass grave containing her victims was covered and its location sealed in confidential records. By late 1892, the Silverbrook murders had been effectively erased from public knowledge. Official records described it as a minor incident involving educational disputes, and no wanted posters or manhunt notices mentioned Elizabeth Morrison's true crimes. Margaret's investigation had uncovered one of the most horrific crimes in frontier history, a systematic child killer who had used society's respect for education to murder 23 innocent children. Her research revealed how the crime had been deliberately buried by authorities who prioritized political considerations over justice. The photograph now resides in the Colorado State Historical Society's special collections, available only to researchers studying frontier crime and child protection. Margaret had worked with the Historical Society to create a proper memorial for Morrison's victims, ensuring their names and stories would finally be remembered. Her research led to the identification of Morrison's victims through dental records, personal effects, and family genealogies. Each of the 23 children murdered at Morrison's Academy now had a marker at the Silverbrook Memorial Site, replacing the anonymous grave where they had been buried for over 130 years. Margaret's investigation also revealed connections to unsolved child disappearances in other territories, suggesting Morrison's crimes had been even more extensive than originally documented. Working with historians in Wyoming and Montana, she had identified at least a dozen additional cases that showed Morrison's characteristic patterns. The family's descendants, located through genealogical research, finally learned the truth about their ancestors' deaths. Many expressed gratitude for the revelation, even though it brought pain. "At least now we know our great-grandmother didn't abandon her family by choice," said Mary Sullivan's great-granddaughter. "She was murdered by someone who exploited every parent's love for their child." Margaret established the Morrison Victims Memorial Fund to support research into historical child abuse cases and to advocate for stronger protections for children in educational settings. She also worked with law enforcement agencies to develop better systems for tracking missing children across jurisdictional boundaries. The case had also revealed how easily authorities could suppress inconvenient truths when political interests conflicted with justice. Margaret's documentation of the official cover-up became part of academic studies examining government accountability and transparency in the American West. Standing before the memorial at the former Silverbrook site, Margaret reflected on the photograph's terrible lesson. The 12 children who had posed for that final portrait had tried to communicate their terror through hidden messages and desperate pleas, but no adult had recognized their silent cries for help. Elizabeth Morrison had used the most trusted relationship in frontier society, that between teacher and student, to commit unspeakable crimes. Her victims had entered her classroom eager to learn and grow, only to discover that their trusted educator was actually their executioner. The photograph served as a permanent reminder that evil could hide behind society's most respected institutions, and that children's safety required constant vigilance from adults who might prefer comfortable assumptions over uncomfortable truths. The children of Morrison's Academy had stood proudly in that final portrait, but they had been hiding desperate pleas for help that went unheard until more than a century too late. Their story proved that sometimes the most shocking thing in a historical photograph isn't what the subjects are displaying with pride, but what they're desperately trying to communicate about the trusted adult standing behind them.